Hello and welcome back to my channel, where today we have a review for the 29th Marvel Cinematic Universe film, that being Taika Waititi's follow-up to his Oscar-winning film Jojo Rabbit, Thor: Love and Thunder. Reteaming with Valkyrie, Korg, and a now Mjolnir wielding Korg, and a now Mjolnir wielding Jane Foster, Thor Odinson finds himself up against Gore the God Butcher, played by Christian Bale, with his motto being that all gods must die.
As the one and only Thor. Oh, spoke too soon. Jane?
There are fleeting moments of Waititi's finesse, but they are unsupported in a rarely coalescing final product. Instead, this feels like a contractually agreed on tonal confusion that kind of gives everybody what they want, but doesn't really give the story what it needs. You definitely sense Waititi's unique creative blend up against the traditional Marvel formula. His visual flair brews this energy as if this film is an after party, with the main party being what he did in 2017 with Thor Ragnarok. That definitely feels like the main event, and this is kind of in the shadow of that, which is funny because Gore's main visual presence is done with shadow monsters. The movie is in the wake of what he captured with Lightning in a Bottle with that first movie, and I think that he sets out to do something different than Ragnarok. And I would have respected that pursuit more if the final film didn't echo Ragnarok to such a degree, but also echo a lesser version of Ragnarok. Once again, we have a compelling villain who's kind of shunted to the sidelines of the film, like Hela was in Ragnarok while we spent so much time on Sakaar, but the Sakaar storyline was just so moving and was thrilling that you kind of didn't mind, even though you knew Cate Blanchett and all her charisma was waiting off screen ready to be utilized. The same thing happens here, where Christian Bale's Gore is just thrillingly captivated. He is so compelling in his unpredictability that the film so desperately desires. He's both haunted yet delicious in how he is just reveling in this opportunity to play a character of this nature, because it's one of the few moments when the film has dramatic tension. This movie doesn't really build in any convincing way. The third act action sequence doesn't feel any different than the end of Act 2 action sequence. In many ways, that action sequence, which takes place in the Shadow Realm, it's the parts in the trailers you've been seeing where everything's black and white, is a lot more visually interesting than what happens in the third action sequence. It's almost like they forgot that they needed a third act action sequence. That's how that final fight comes off. And sure, it has a lot of funny gags. There's a bit with some children there, but in the end, it doesn't feel like this was completely well thought out. For example, one of the more interesting ideas that Waititi brings to this script is the presence of gods in our society and folklore, and the weight that those figures have in our lives. But there's not too much he can do with that, because Gore's whole attitude about the culpability and the hypocrisy of gods really can't be hit home when your main character is a god. You're not going to have the movie turn on your main character, and that's why it feels that every new idea this movie brings up is at odds with the existing ideas that have already been established within the Thor franchise. There is a boldness, though, that I admire about Waititi's vision that I think you've been seeing in a lot of Phase 4 movies. All of these directors are playing with the idea of what an MCU movie can be, and I think most of the directors, including Waititi, get away with some of the problems or some of the lulls in the story because you do admire the newness that they're trying to create. And there are many moments where lightning seems to have struck twice with this movie. There's a wonderful montage that expresses Thor and Jane's relationship and their breakup, essentially. And there's so much earned emotion in that montage. It's a very quick scene, but you get the pain and the pleasure of love. And I think in moments like that, moments like when Thor and Jane are talking and there's either a burning house behind them that collapses, that captures their inner emotions, or the spark of Stormbreaker, which captures their love reuniting, there are inventive directorial choices that bring a pedestrian humanity to this godly story that grounds the emotion in ways that you just wanted more of, but so rarely do they actually adhere to that desire. The movie is paced at a nice click, and I think the movie succeeds in visually distinguishing one set piece from the next. Every time we move on to a new sequence, it looks different. It feels different in many ways too. The costume design by Macy's Ribera, who also did some work on WandaVision and other Marvel properties, matches Waititi's eccentric vision with some really fun costume choices that help to fill out the world building of the specific corner that Love and Thunder is creating. These costumes could have only worked for a movie about Thor directed by Taika Waititi, and I appreciate the artistic identity that's found within these costumes and within some of the production design as well. The artifice and the artistic design of this film is definitely one of its greatest attributes. And when you have a cast full of Oscar winners and MCU favorites, you just know that the cast is able. They know how to play these roles, and they are giving these characters, I think, more depth than you may find in the script. You get the sense that the cast is the inspiration for this goat-led rainbow boat ride. It's not so much the other way around, where many times the script will inspire the actors to make choices. This feels like the actors inspired the writers to make the choice. The other thing that I felt persistently throughout this film was the idea that this story has been cut down. Waititi has talked about his 4-hour cut, and you definitely feel that there's a lot of substance lacking because the film had to be cut down and they decided that the visual flair was more important than a lot of the, I assume, humor moments. I mean, those 2 hours might have been just filled with the orgy that they talk about every 2 seconds during the Zeus scene. I don't know. We'll probably never see those 2 hours, but there's just a part of this thing that just feels incomplete. In many ways also, it had this weird feeling of an R-rated movie that was cut down to a PG-13 film. A lot of the comedic jokes, there are many storylines, and just the whole vibe of the film feels a lot more mature, but also feels a lot childish. It feels almost sophomoric. It's this weird balance between the two that makes the film feel tonally unstable. It's grasping for both ends, trying to thrust them together, trying to be a fun Marvel movie while also being this offbeat, off-kilter comedy. However, the needle drops don't come to Stranger Things 4 level, but they are impressive. Definitely for a Marvel movie, this stands among, I think, the Guardians of the Galaxy for great soundtrack moments. From the Guns N' Roses song you've seen in the trailers, from a really fun use of ABBA's Our Last Summer, there's a lot of great moments when the soundtrack comes in, and I was hearing it on the IMAX speakers. It just pumped me up. And I do think this movie intends to pump you up. It wants to leave you with a smile on your face. And I think, while I really appreciate the desire to fill an audience with happiness, I do think how they do that undercuts a lot of the elements of the story that you really wish they spent more time on. There's just an idea of what could have been with this movie, and I think that's just unfortunately and disappointingly captured in Jane. Natalie Portman is one of the greatest actors of her generation, and it's just so frustrating to see her constantly be given underwritten characters that feel unnecessary and almost pointless to the story that's being told. There's a running gag with her where she's trying to find her superhero catchphrase, and you're just sitting there like, really, this is the best that you could come up with after her almost 8-year hiatus in the MCU. You had so much time to pull any storyline from Jason Aaron's run and Russell Dauterman when they wrote The Mighty Thor. Like, you could have done anything. And this is really what you thought of that storyline in the comics. This is what you wanted to give Natalie Portman as a return. It was just so close. It could have been so wonderful to see this storyline play out. And I don't necessarily think that the genre precluded a lot of the substance to be earned. I think that, as we saw with Waititi's previous film, Jojo Rabbit, he can take such dark material and find a way to mix it together in this collage of tone and comedy and drama. And here, I was kind of expecting the same thing to happen, but it almost feels like he didn't want to tell the Jane cancer story, that it was an afterthought, that whole storyline was being thrusted on the story with each draft, and almost like it was written by another writer. There's just no reason for it to be a part of this movie, and the way that it's injected into this narrative almost feels like somebody scotch taping a photo of themselves onto a framed family portrait. Like, Jane just doesn't need to be in this story, and I think that's really upsetting because for me, she kind of was the reason I was excited for this, because the storyline from the comics is so brilliant. It just really doesn't have a place in the movie that Waititi wants to do tonally. Anytime we cut to her cancer storyline, when we see her weak with the cancer, it just feels at odds with the rest of the movie. When Jane Foster was Thor in the comics, Thor wasn't Thor. He wasn't being the superhero actively at that time. So she wasn't playing a sidekick. She was the main hero. But here, it is so clearly that she is the sidekick. The movie is very clearly about Chris Hemsworth's Thor, and Natalie Portman is a supporting character, which I think robs a lot of the agency out of that character. It makes her costume choice to mirror that of Thor Odinson. When we're watching him stand right beside her, it makes it seem like she's the Supergirl to his Superman instead of being equals. And what makes this all a little bit more troubling is just that Chris Hemsworth's Thor really doesn't have that much to do. I think you're starting to feel the strain with him now 11 years after his first introduction in the first Thor, that they're really struggling to find unique things, new things to do with him. And so they kind of just fall on his greatest hits. And that's how I would describe a lot of this movie. This feels like the B-side of a great album, or a greatest hits collection that doesn't really tie into one song from the next. You'll have one song from their early period and then one song from the late period, and they just throw them in a mishmash together where, sure, the mixtape then reminds you of a fun vibe. It's a fun thing to look back and think about all the memories you made together in the past, but it doesn't mean that this standalone chapter stands alone. Because when all is said and done, all of these actors are not being asked to play characters, they're being asked to play comedians. It's a comedy that doesn't have a lot going on underneath the surface, because comedy doesn't mean lack of substance, but this one does, because again, it's more focused on one-liners. It's not intricate. There's no sense of internal logic with the movie and how it approaches its comedic stylings. In the end, the comedy isn't intellectual enough to support the story that's being told. This movie just feels like it wants to have fun, but I think what they end up doing is having too much of a good thing. It's a movie that's visually brilliant, but not personally brilliant. And I definitely would prefer the latter over the former, because for a movie that's billed as love and thunder, there's a little bit too much thunder deafening out the love. So those are my thoughts on Thor, Love and Thunder. I'm looking forward to seeing it again, seeing if my opinions change or not. I mean, Multiverse of Madness, as you'll see when I do an MCU ranked video next week after Miss Marvel Wraps, has dramatically changed thanks to rewatches. So hopefully Thor, Love and Thunder does as well. But as far as my first viewing, I have to say I was underwhelmed, and I think that hopefully there's a little bit of a tighter grasp next time if we get a Thor 5 from Taika Waititi. Please let me know your thoughts on the film in the comments below. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to not miss any new videos from Spoilers Ahead with Anthony Post. Thank you all so much, and I'll see you at the movies.